called him a god, yet he ruled like a demon. In the heart of ancient Egypt, one young pharaoh turned paradise into a nightmare. His obsession with pleasure and immortality gave birth to rituals so cruel that even time tried to bury them. This is the story of Pepi II, the child who became a monster. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, do you believe power can truly corrupt the soul? And if you love uncovering the dark secrets of history, subscribe now and stay till the end. This story will change the way you see kings forever. Chapter 1. The Honey Chambers of Horror. Imagine the suffocating heat of a subterranean chamber, hidden beneath the endless Egyptian sands. The year is 2200 BCE. Torches flicker along sandstone walls, carved with serpentine hieroglyphs that speak of gods, death, and eternity. You are a young soldier summoned in the dead of night. No explanation, only an order. Bring 10 jars of honey and tell no one. The command feels strange, but defiance is unthinkable. Now you stand frozen as attendants pour the glistening amber liquid over the bare body of a boy no older than 12. His skin gleams like gold beneath the flames' dance. He's been trained to remain still, silent, a living statue. But his eyes betray him. They scream. From the darkness comes the low hum of wings. Clay jars lining the walls begin to tremble. Within them live creatures bred for cruelty, the sacred and the profane. The lids are lifted. First, the scarab beetles emerge, black and glistening, worshipped as symbols of rebirth, yet now instruments of torment. Then come the fire ants, their venom potent and burning, harvested from distant Nubian valleys and fed on the blood of slaves. Above, the buzzing grows louder. Wasps, raised in smoke and rage, circling in an angry storm. But in the far corner stands a 4th jar, sealed with wax and copper, containing something worse. Something that will feed Egypt's nightmares for millennia. Into this grotesque theater steps the pharaoh himself, Pepi II Neferkare, the boy king turned god, now a frail man near 100 years old. He has ruled Egypt since childhood, reigning for over 90 years, outliving sons, grandsons, and entire dynasties. His withered body is draped in gold, his eyes clouded yet coldly alert. At a flick of his hand, the servants obey. The insects are released. The chamber erupts. Scarabs scuttle across the honeyed skin, their mandibles digging deep. The child convulses, fighting the urge to scream. The ants follow, pouring over him in searing waves, their bites igniting fire beneath the flesh. Then come the wasps, stingers flashing in the torchlight, until the boy's face swells. His body becomes a patchwork of wounds, and what remains of his humanity dissolves into agony. And through it all, Pepi watches, not horrified, fascinated. His thin lips curl into something between satisfaction and curiosity. He gives calm instructions like a conductor refining a symphony of suffering. More honey on the feet, he murmurs. Let the ants return to the wounds. The ritual continues for hours. The boy survives, barely. When it's over, healers tend to him, applying ointments to preserve his body. Not from mercy, but practicality. Such victims are costly to replace. When he recovers, the process begins anew. This was no isolated act. It was a system. Over 9 decades, tens of thousands of children would vanish into Pepi's underground sanctums, the infamous honey chambers. Their existence was buried in royal archives, erased from temple walls, yet whispered in foreign accounts and confirmed centuries later by archaeologists uncovering mass graves near Saqqara. But how does a child become such a monster? To understand Pepi II, one must go back to the beginning. To the day innocence died and divinity took its place. For the young prince Neferkare, it began not with cruelty, but with loss. His father, Pepi I, died suddenly. The official record claims a scorpion sting, yet witnesses noted that the wounds were suspiciously clean, shaped like the mark of a dagger. Within days, Pepi's elder brother, heir to the throne, also perished, reportedly of river fever, though he had been deep in the desert, miles from any river. The court fell into chaos, and the youngest son, barely 6 years old, was thrust onto the throne. The coronation was meant to transform mortal into god, but what happens when the initiate is still a child, unable to grasp metaphor? Before an audience of thousands, priests stripped him bare, anointed him with oils, and declared him the living embodiment of Horus. The boy believed them, how could he not? From that day forward, every whim became law, every thought divine command. He was never told no again. The result was inevitable. Without boundaries, without empathy, Pepi's divine delusion grew unchecked. Isolation fed obsession, fear turned to fascination, and in time, curiosity transformed into cruelty. The honey chambers were not built overnight. They evolved from rituals meant to please the gods, twisted into horrors meant to please one man. Historians often speak of Egypt's grandeur, its pyramids, its art, its theology of rebirth, but they rarely discuss the price of such immortality. Under Pepi II's reign, Egypt's resources drained into his excesses. Temples grew silent, grain stores emptied, armies weakened, and as tens of thousands of children vanished into the sands, the great old kingdom began to crumble from within. The God King had devoured his own future. Pepi II wasn't born a monster. He was made one. By a crown placed too early, by power without consequence, by a nation that worshipped him as divine, long after he'd forgotten what it meant to be human. So as we open the darkest chapter of ancient Egypt, ask yourself this: what happens when a society gives absolute power to a child and never takes it back? Chapter 2: A Child Crowned in Blood. The air inside the great hall was thick with incense and anticipation. A snow-white bull, bred for years in sacred secrecy, was led to the center of the chamber where gold and ivory gleamed under torchlight. Its life ended with a single perfect cut, clean, ritualistic. Blood erupted in a crimson arc, cascading into a vast golden basin that shimmered like liquid fire. The animal's body trembled as its spirit fled, and before its eyes had even dimmed, the priests lifted the chosen child, Pharaoh Pepi II, toward the steaming pool. Without hesitation, they plunged him in. The sacred blood swallowed him whole. He kicked and struggled, lungs burning, arms flailing as panic overtook instinct. Seconds stretched like eternity, until finally he was pulled out, gasping and drenched, the stench of iron and death clinging to his tiny frame. The priests braced for tears, for screams, for the terrified sobs of a 6-year-old ripped from innocence. But instead, he laughed. It wasn't the nervous titter of shock, nor the madness of fear. It was pure delight, the gleeful laughter of a child discovering something beautiful. Staring at his blood-slick hands, Pepi examined them with awe, then licked a crimson finger and smiled. "Can I go under again?" he asked. The high priest, a man who had witnessed decades of ritual slaughter, would later confess in his private writings that he had never known fear until that moment, when the boy smiled through a mask of gore. But the ritual had only begun. The next act would decide if this child truly bore divine favor. A prisoner was dragged forward, an unremarkable thief who had stolen bread from the temple stores. His knees hit the floor before the new Pharaoh. Into Pepi's small hands, the priests placed a ceremonial bronze blade, too heavy for him to wield properly. His command was simple, absolute: strike. Prove that the god's power flows through your veins. The first swing missed entirely, the blade pulling the child off balance and sending him sprawling into the blood-soaked floor. A murmur rippled through the court. Would he cry? Would the illusion of divine birth shatter here, in this moment of childish failure? Pepi rose slowly, unshaken. His small hands tightened on the handle as he studied the weapon, the way a scholar might examine a text. He adjusted his stance, squared his tiny shoulders, and tried again. The second strike tore into the prisoner's shoulder, splattering blood across the nobles. The third cracked teeth. The fourth opened a throat, but failed to sever the spine. By the time the man's body stopped moving, any normal child would have fled in horror. But Pepi did not stop. He kept swinging, methodical, focused, learning with each attempt. 11 blows later, the head came free, rolling across the floor to rest near the priest's feet. Pepi bent down, lifted it gently, and stared into its vacant eyes. When a trembling priest asked what the boy had whispered to the severed head, the child smiled faintly and answered, "I asked it what death tastes like." After a pause, he added, "I think I know now. It tastes like power." That moment defined him, not as a victim of trauma, but as a creature of revelation. At 6 years old, Pepi II had glimpsed something eternal in death, and he would spend nearly a century chasing that understanding. The coronation continued, but now the ritual took a darker turn. 23 women stood before him, the secondary wives of his deceased father, destined by custom to accompany the old pharaoh into the afterlife. Tradition demanded they drink poisoned wine, a swift and ceremonial passing. But Pepi, reborn through blood, demanded something different. He wanted to see death, to study it, to know its every detail. He ordered silk cords instead. The executions took 4 hours. Pepi sat upon a throne too large for his small frame, feet dangling above the floor, eyes fixed and unblinking as each woman's breath was slowly stolen. Sometimes he paused the stranglers, commanding them to let a victim recover before continuing, just to observe the moment when the will to live finally broke. He was not playing the tyrant. He was conducting an experiment, a child scientist dissecting the boundary between life and death. When the last wife had fallen, there remained the children, 41 half-siblings who might one day claim the throne. The boys were executed swiftly, their ends unremarkable. But for the girls, Pepi created a new kind of cruelty. Each was forced to watch her family die before being given a choice: serve him for life or follow their mothers into the afterlife. 6 chose servitude. Decades later, one of them, an old woman with shaking hands, would recount the moment. She said the young pharaoh didn't simply rule with fear. He studied it. He would visit them at random hours, silently watching as they ate, slept, or wept. He wanted to see what fear did to the body, how it changed breathing, posture, and the sound of a voice. He spoke often of something he called the divine silence, the instant when terror became so overwhelming that the mind retreated into nothingness. By the age of 8, Pepi's curiosity had evolved into method. He began experimenting with poisons, seeking combinations that could still the body but leave the mind alert. Servants and prisoners disappeared into the palace dungeons and never returned. He documented everything: the twitch of a finger, the dilation of eyes, the exact moment when awareness faded. Pepi II had been crowned in blood, and from that baptism he drew not madness, but purpose. To him, death was not horror. It was knowledge, and knowledge was divine. The child who had once laughed through a veil of crimson now sat upon the throne of Egypt, a god in flesh, his reign destined to become one of the longest and most feared in human history. The boy who tasted blood had found his truth. Death was power. Chapter 3. The Making of a Monster. By the time Pepi II turned 9, his fascination with death had become something more. An academic pursuit, a structured discipline that his tutors were forced to indulge. The study of human suffering became as formal a subject as mathematics or hieroglyphs. Every experiment, every observation was carefully recorded and categorized under his command. The palace scribes, once chroniclers of royal decrees, now found themselves writing grim manuals on agony, documenting its patterns and nuances, like scholars charting the stars. It was at this tender age that Pepi made what he proudly called his first philosophical discovery. Pain, he decided, was not one emotion, but a multitude, a spectrum of flavors, each unique and worthy of classification. The sting of flame, the slice of a blade, the venom of poison, the bite of insects, all distinct, all worthy of understanding. Like a vintner distinguishing the subtleties of wine, the boy Pharaoh began cataloging torment with chilling precision. This compendium of suffering became his great work, a living archive of what he deemed the purest truth of existence. The depth of this obsession revealed itself during a morning court session when he was 10. The grand chamber was filled with ministers, generals, and priests, discussing urgent matters: a famine in Upper Egypt, raids along the borders, tributes from foreign lands. Then as they debated, a cat leapt through an open window, clutching a bird in its jaws. The tiny creature's wings snapped, and it began to flutter helplessly, gasping for life as the cat toyed with it. Pepi froze. Every official in the room went silent, their eyes darting between the child god and the dying bird. Minutes passed, then hours, as the ruler of Egypt sat motionless, studying the scene with holy intensity. Finally, one nervous courtier broke the silence, respectfully suggesting that the meeting continue. It was a fatal mistake. Pepi ordered the man beaten unconscious on the spot for daring to interrupt divine observation. When the bird finally succumbed, Pepi called the cat forward, fed it scraps from his own plate, and declared it sacred. Any creature that killed slowly, he proclaimed, was a vessel of divine truth. Through that moment, the boy king understood something that would define his reign. Death was not an event. It was a process, a transformation, and that process was holy. By the age of 11, the emperor's philosophical reflections had turned into doctrine. In a letter to his general, Harkov, who was returning from Nubia with gifts, Pepi's transformation was fully evident. The letter at first seemed childishly eager. He wanted to see the pygmy dancer Harkov had found. But buried within the text was a cold threat. The dwarf was to be checked every 48 minutes through the night. If he died before reaching Memphis, every sailor's children would be fed to crocodiles while their fathers watched. If he escaped, the entire crew would be impaled. If he arrived injured, Harkov himself would experience the same wounds tenfold. But it was the postscript that revealed the true nature of Pepi's mind. He requested a second gift, a normal child of the same weight as the dwarf. He wanted to compare how long each could survive without water, how their screams varied, how their flesh reacted to heat. The dancer was not an entertainer. He was a data point in the Pharaoh's growing library of suffering. By 16, Pepe's role had shifted from observer to participant. His blessings of servants' children, once seen as divine favor, became private rituals of cruelty. Boys entered his chambers healthy and bright-eyed. Some limped out broken, others never reappeared. Whispers began to spread among the servants, but no one dared speak them aloud. The God King's will was law, and law did not question divinity. At 24, Pepe's appetite for knowledge led to his first major scandal. The son of a noble family, 13 years old, had been invited to join the palace musicians. 3 days later, his body was returned, mutilated beyond recognition. The embalmer refused to prepare him, claiming his ka, his life force, had been irreparably damaged. The family, wealthy and influential, demanded justice. Pepe's response was as brilliant as it was horrifying. He announced that the boy had been chosen for sacred transformation, that his agony had opened paths to divine wisdom. To question this, he said, was to blaspheme. He then summoned the family to the palace to receive blessings and compensation. They were never seen again. Their estates were absorbed into the royal treasury. It was during this period that Pepe created a new position within his court, the overseer of royal entertainments. The name sounded festive, ceremonial. In reality, it was the foundation of a machine built to sustain his cruelty. The first to hold the title was Keti, a man chosen for his utter absence of empathy. Within months, Keti had assembled a vast network of scouts, transporters, physicians, guards, and disposers. Boys between 8 and 14 were selected with surgical precision. Height, weight, complexion, even the tone of their voices mattered. Pepe preferred high-pitched screams, which his aging ears found more pleasing. By his 50s, the child god had long ceased to be a man. He had become a myth of terror. It was then that the infamous honey rituals began, his symphonies of sensation, as he called them. The inspiration came from a warehouse accident in which a laborer, drenched in spilled honey, was devoured by ants. Pepe witnessed the spectacle and claimed to have experienced communion with divine suffering. To him, this was the ultimate revelation. Torment delivered not by human hands, but by nature itself. The insects were blameless, their cruelty was divine. Within weeks, a new chamber was built beneath the palace, a soundproof tomb of stone and bitumen with drains in the floor and hooks on the ceiling. There, Pepe II sought to orchestrate the purest pain the world had ever known. The boy who once studied death had now mastered it. What had begun as curiosity had become doctrine, and what had started with observation ended in creation. Egypt's god-king no longer sought to understand suffering. He sought to perfect it. Pepe's reign would stretch into legend, not as the era of prosperity his monuments proclaimed, but as the age when one man's fascination with pain reshaped the very soul of a civilization. The making of a monster was complete. Chapter 4. The Birth of the Honey Rituals. Within a year, the palace dungeons beneath Pharaoh Pepe II's golden halls had transformed into something unholy, a vast network of 9 chambers, each crafted for a distinct and terrible purpose. It was no longer a single torture room, but an entire complex, a labyrinth designed not for punishment, but for experimentation. The first chamber was the preparation hall, where the chosen victims, usually boys selected for their physical qualities, were stripped, washed, and anointed with oils. The second was the honey room, the heart of the ritual, where the main ceremonies took place. Nearby was the beetle pit, filled with carnivorous scarabs bred to consume flesh. The serpent chamber was reserved for victims who had grown resistant to the insect trials, where snakes were used to test endurance against venom and constriction. The water room held pools filled with creatures not native to Egypt, brought from the darkest swamps of Africa, bred for purposes no sane mind could imagine. Then came the fire chamber, where heat and smoke were weaponized into instruments of divine revelation. Afterward, the recovery room housed survivors who were kept alive, patched up by palace physicians only to endure fresh rounds of torment. The disposal chamber ended the cycle, and at the center of it all stood a raised platform, the observation deck, where Pepe sat enthroned, watching everything as though he were observing a sacred ritual rather than orchestrating a nightmare. But the honey itself was what turned this horror into a science. Pepe's alchemists and torturers soon realized that pure honey, while attracting insects, did not provoke the ferocity he desired. Through endless trials on early victims, they perfected what they called the divine blend, a formula that transformed honey into a weapon. When mixed with human saliva, its scent became irresistible to certain insects. Tears added the salt that drove them into a frenzy. A few drops of blood drew predators that sought protein. But above all, fear was the most potent ingredient. The pheromones released by terrified children merged with the honey, creating an intoxicating aroma that summoned insects into a violent swarm. The insects themselves were bred and conditioned with the same meticulous attention. Scarabs were fed exclusively on raw flesh until they learned to associate the scent of human skin with food. Fire ants were selected for venom. From his elevated platform, Pepe directed the ordeal like a conductor leading a symphony. "More honey on the feet," he would call. "Add another handful of ants to the left arm. Remove the wasps from the eyes, but leave the beetles longer." Each command was a note in his orchestral arrangement of screams. The Pharaoh's obsession was not merely cruelty, it was control. He sought to master pain as one might master music. Sessions often lasted for hours, paused and resumed to prolong the experience. Death was considered failure. The goal was endurance. The boys who survived were taken to the recovery chambers, treated just enough to heal before being sent back for another session. Some were used for months, their bodies hollowed and scarred until they finally expired, or until Pepe grew bored. By the 70 years of his rule, the empire itself had reshaped around this monstrous devotion. Egypt's economy, once the envy of the ancient world, now bent toward sustaining one man's rituals. Fields that should have produced grain grew flowers instead, to feed the bees that made the honey. Production of honey in Pepe's final decades exceeded that of the previous 100 years combined. And all this while famine stalked the land, as the Nile's floods began to fail. Entire industries arose to serve the rituals. The overseer of royal entertainments commanded a vast network of subordinates, 4 regional directors, each overseeing 10 provincial coordinators, who in turn managed teams of village scouts. Over 200 officials worked solely to find suitable children. Supporting them were craftsmen and traders, boat builders who modified vessels with hidden compartments, blacksmiths who forged restraints small enough for young limbs, potters who designed containers for breeding insects, and farmers who specialized in cultivating venomous species. Merchants traveled from Nubia and the Levant, bringing strange foreign creatures to fuel the Pharaoh's twisted experiments. The selection process itself became an art form. Surviving documents describe 47 criteria: height within 2 fingers measure, weight precise to half a deben, skin tone matched against painted shards of pottery, even the pitch of their voices tested during selection. Pepi preferred screams he could still hear clearly through the ringing in his aging ears, higher, sharper tones of terror. As word of the rituals spread, entire villages devised desperate ways to protect their sons. Some claimed mysterious plagues that afflicted only boys of suitable age. Others faked raids, pretending their children had been taken by desert nomads. The governor of Abydos famously reported that his province had been cursed with ugliness by the gods, rendering its boys unworthy of divine attention. Yet none of it mattered. The honey continued to flow, the insects continued to feed, and Pepi II's empire, once radiant with civilization, had become a vast machine, built to nourish the appetite of one man's divinity. The God King had found his paradise in pain, and Egypt bled to keep it alive. Chapter 5. Egypt's Machinery of Obedience. As Egypt bled beneath the weight of its God King's obsessions, the governors of its provinces began weaving lies to survive. The governor of Hierakonpolis swore before the court that torrential floods had washed away 3 entire villages. The governor of Edfu claimed that packs of jackals had developed a taste for human flesh and carried off every child. But deception had no power in Pepi II's Egypt. When the palace discovered the truth, both governors were executed, publicly, brutally, and their families reduced to slaves. Their replacements wasted no time in proving loyalty, sending double their required number of boys to the palace as tribute. The message echoed across the land like a divine decree: deliver the children, or become part of the offering yourself. Desperation reshaped the face of the kingdom. The wealthy hid their sons in Nubia or Libya, claiming death by fever or disease. The poor, unable to flee, resorted to darker measures. Some scarred their boys' faces with hot metal, others shattered limbs to create deformities. Mothers dosed their children with herbal poisons that induced convulsions or sickness, hoping illness would make them undesirable to the collectors. But the cruelty of fate spared few. Pepi's agents often took the disfigured and dying anyway, viewing their broken forms as a new form of amusement. The demographic collapse that followed defied comprehension. In some provinces, nearly 70% of the male children vanished within a generation. There were no battle scars to explain the loss, no plague to justify the absence, only silence and empty homes. Near Memphis, the heart of Pepi's dominion, the disappearance was near total. Burial records from the region show an eerie absence of young boys, as if they had simply ceased to exist. The dead were not being buried in their villages because they were dying elsewhere, beneath the palace in chambers sticky with honey and echoing with screams. Eventually, the horror gave birth to rebellion. Grieving fathers, farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen banded together under a single name: the Fathers of the Lost. Armed with stolen tools and old weapons, they attacked caravans and ambushed the scouts who hunted their sons. For 6 fleeting months, they managed to free several dozen captives and even killed a few of Pepi's procurers. But their triumphs were brief, and the vengeance that followed was unimaginable. Pepi's retaliation was a masterclass in terror. Every male member of any suspected resistance family, infants to elders, was brought to Memphis. They were subjected to the honey rituals, not swiftly, but with calculated endurance. Palace physicians kept them alive for days, ensuring each man remained conscious while his body was consumed by insects. Their wives and daughters were forced to watch. It was not punishment, it was theater. The God King wanted an audience for his wrath. One tale, preserved in Nubian oral history, speaks of a small village that chose to die rather than surrender. When scouts arrived, they found over 800 bodies lying together in the town square. families who had drunk poison in a pact of defiance. Yet even in death, Pepi claimed victory. The scouts collected the corpses of the children, slathered them in honey, and displayed them in the palace courtyard. The pharaoh's fury at being denied living victims was so great that he declared their bodies would sweeten the air for eternity. By the 80th year of Pepi's reign, Egypt's decline had spread beyond its borders. Once the envy of the ancient world, the empire had become a warning. Civilizations that had traded with Egypt for centuries now called it cursed. A Sumerian tablet from this era offers chilling insight into how far the disgust had reached. It commands merchants to treat any Egyptian traveler as unclean, forbidding them from entering temples for a full year. Egyptian goods were to be burned on sight, and anyone found trading with the land of blood would lose all property. One line summarized the sentiment of the known world. There, children enter palaces and do not leave. There, the ruler feasts upon the innocent as lions feast upon gazelles. Even the Nubians, once loyal tributaries, fortified their borders and ceased the flow of gold and ivory. Egyptian raids seeking new victims were met with empty villages and decoys. Children were hidden in desert camps, guarded by warriors, sworn to die before yielding them. One surviving inscription carved into Nubian stone reads simply, "Let the monster of Memphis starve, for neither gold nor child shall cross our sands again." Even the mysterious sea peoples, who feared no mortal power, began to steer clear of Egyptian shores. A fragment from Crete records Egyptian harbors as lands forsaken by the gods, where the air reeks of death and honey. Ships would sail hundreds of miles out of their way to avoid the taint of Egyptian ports. The consequences were catastrophic. Trade collapsed. Without tin, bronze production halted, reducing Egypt's armies to obsolete relics. Without Lebanese cedar, shipbuilding and temple construction stagnated. Without incense from Punt, priests could no longer perform sacred rites, their altars cold and silent. Agriculture, already crippled by the diversion of farmland to feed the bees, failed completely. Fields that once yielded grain now bloomed with useless flowers. Starvation swept the land as honey flowed into the palace. Internally, Egypt began to devour itself. The powerful priesthood of Amun in Thebes, long the foundation of the monarchy, began to distance itself from Memphis. Temple records from this period avoid naming Pepi entirely, referring instead to the distant throne or the one who has forgotten the gods. Some temples refused royal demands outright, claiming poverty or divine silence. Others sealed their sanctuaries, choosing isolation over complicity. The military, once the embodiment of Egyptian pride, had dissolved into shadow. Young men refused to serve, fearing their assignments would lead not to battlefields, but to child raids. Officers deserted in growing numbers, unwilling to stain their names in service of madness. By the twilight of Pepi II's reign, Egypt had become a hollow empire, an empty husk sustained by terror, its economy strangled, its faith broken, its people vanished. The God-King sat upon his throne, surrounded by silence and honey, ruling over a kingdom that no longer believed in him. And though his monuments still stood, casting long shadows across the sand, they no longer marked the glory of Egypt, only the grave of its humanity. Chapter 6. The Fall of a Civilization. By the 85th year of Pepi II's reign, Egypt was a hollow empire. Whole garrisons deserted their posts, vanishing into the western deserts to live as bandits rather than serve a tyrant who had turned the land of the Nile into a graveyard of children. The once mighty military that had carried Egypt's banners across Nubia and Canaan was reduced to little more than the palace guard. and even they began disappearing into the night, choosing exile over obedience. As the Pharaoh entered his 90s, his monstrous appetites had not withered with age. They had simply evolved into something even darker. The infamous honey rituals that once entertained him for weeks now failed to sustain his interest for more than a few hours. He demanded ever greater horrors, new sensations to pierce the numbness of nearly a century of absolute depravity. The palace expanded like a tumor to house his growing obsessions. Where once 9 ritual chambers stood, there were now 27. Within these halls, screams replaced hymns. One boy might be subjected to the honey ritual, another thrown into a pit of serpents, a third locked within a room filled with flesh-eating beetles. Others endured torments so unspeakable that the scribes who recorded palace events refused to describe them, even in secret texts. At 96 years old, Pepe was too frail to walk. He was carried between chambers on a golden litter, stopping briefly to watch each new act of horror before demanding the next. Witnesses said that the cries of his victims merged into a single dreadful harmony that echoed through the thick stone walls, a sound later remembered by one escaped servant as the Symphony of the Damned. But the machinery that sustained his evil was crumbling. Egypt's villages had been emptied of boys, families hid or fled, provinces could no longer meet their quotas. The illusion of divine selection gave way to open terror. Armed soldiers storming towns at dawn, seizing every child old enough to walk but too young to bear a beard. Those who resisted were killed on the spot. Homes that concealed children were burned to ash. A surviving papyrus fragment, hidden by a worker who could no longer bear the sight, recounts one such raid. 43 boys taken in chains, 17 fathers slaughtered trying to stop them, their homes smoldering in silence by noon. Even within the palace, collapse was inevitable. Servants fled rather than clean the blood from the ritual floors. Guards deserted in the night rather than lead more raids. Record keepers destroyed archives, setting fire to scrolls to erase their complicity. The vast bureaucracy that had kept Pepe's horrors organized finally began to rot from within, just as its creator reached the height of his madness. The final ritual, according to a guard who escaped immediately afterward, was so vile that even Greek historians, centuries later, refused to write the details. They would only say that 40 children were used, and that it involved creatures bred beyond natural size, and substances that burned the flesh. It lasted through the night. None survived. And when dawn came, Pepe II, ancient, decayed, and smiling, was carried back to his chamber. 3 days later, the God King died in his sleep, clutching a piece of honeycomb in one hand, his lips frozen in what witnesses called an eternal hunger. He had ruled for 94 years. He had outlived 8 generations of his own blood. He had consumed the lives of nearly 50,000 children. And yet in the end, not a single punishment ever reached him. But when he died, Egypt itself seemed to die alongside him. The moment the news spread through the palace, panic consumed the court. Not grief, but fear. There were no mourning rituals, no prayers. Instead, a frenzy of destruction erupted. Servants hurled entire libraries of papyrus into bonfires that burned for days. Stone inscriptions were chiseled off the palace walls, some so violently that entire chambers collapsed. The infamous honey chambers were sealed with blocks so immense they would never be opened again. The children still held captive in palace dormitories presented a final horror. Releasing them would expose the truth. Killing them outright would draw suspicion. So the solution was silence. They were sealed inside and left to die in the dark, forgotten by the world that had failed them. Pepe's successor, Merenre II, reigned for less than a year. His only lasting legacy was the systematic erasure of his predecessors' crimes. Every record that mentioned the procurement system was destroyed. Every official who had enforced it was executed or fled into exile. The priests tasked with embalming Pepi took their revenge in secret. Instead of preserving his body for eternity, they ensured his damnation. They reversed his wrappings, placed his organs in the wrong canopic jars, and filled his corpse with living beetles that would devour him from within. It was not mummification, it was justice written in flesh. Even his pyramid was built as an act of sabotage. The builders used cheap limestone, weak mortar, and unstable beams so that the structure would one day collapse in on itself. Within a century, the ceiling caved in, crushing Pepi's sarcophagus and scattering his remains to dust. The pharaoh who had thought himself a god was erased by the very hands that once served him. In the end, Egypt did not fall to foreign invaders or famine. It fell to its own rot. A civilization that once built wonders for eternity was undone by one man's insatiable hunger for suffering. The empire of the Nile, once radiant with light, drowned in darkness of its own making. Chapter 7. Death of a God-King. When the builders sealed Pepi II's tomb, they ensured his destruction would come from within. The very stones meant to immortalize him were designed to collapse and crush his remains. It was poetic justice, a monument turned executioner, consuming its maker just as he had consumed his people. And as his corrupted body decayed beneath failing limestone, Egypt itself began to fracture. The great kingdom that had stood united for 8 centuries splintered almost overnight. With the pharaoh's death, the illusion of divine order shattered. Governors declared independence, generals turned to warlords, and once prosperous provinces descended into chaos. The lifeblood of Egypt, its irrigation canals, fell into ruin. Without maintenance, the Nile's floods brought not renewal, but destruction. Fields withered, harvests failed, and famine spread across the land once called the gift of the Nile. Trade routes that had connected Egypt to the Mediterranean and the Levant vanished, replaced by silence and suspicion. The ports of the Delta grew empty. The markets of Memphis turned to dust. The scribes, the guardians of Egypt's knowledge, scattered with what little they could carry. Libraries that had preserved generations of wisdom disappeared, their scrolls either burned or buried. In some regions, entire lineages of scholars vanished, centuries of thought erased in a single lifetime. The demographic wound was beyond healing. For generations, Egypt's sons had been stolen, tortured, or slain. It wasn't just a loss of individuals, it was the extinction of bloodlines. Families that might have built the next era simply ceased to exist. In some nomes, villages never recovered, their ruins swallowed by sand. The trauma of those years became part of Egypt's soul, an unspoken scar that shaped its politics and faith for the next 1,000 years. But Pepi's horror was not unique in the vast story of human depravity. It was merely the most complete, the most organized, the most meticulously recorded. History would echo his pattern again and again. The Roman Emperor Tiberius, who turned the island of Capri into a private nightmare, where children served as his little fishes. Gilles de Rais, the French noble and war hero, who murdered hundreds of children under his own roof. Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Each of them wielded absolute power in isolation, each consumed by the same disease of the soul. The only difference was scale, and Pepi ruled longer than any of them, 94 years of unchecked evil. Pepi II's reign was not just tyranny. It was industrialized cruelty. He transformed the act of murder into a bureaucratic ritual, creating offices and systems to maintain the constant flow of victims. He didn't simply indulge his perversion, he built an empire around it. In this, he stands as one of history's earliest architects of systematic atrocity, a man who made suffering part of the state machinery. Psychologists and historians alike recognize the same pattern repeating across time. When power is absolute and accountability absent, empathy decays. Those who rise too young or too insulated from consequence never learn to see others as human. People become tools, props, flesh to be used. Then comes the hunger, the addiction. What begins as curiosity becomes compulsion. The thrill dulls, and new extremes are required to feel anything at all. The result is always escalation, both in cruelty and in structure. Bureaucracies of evil are born from the need to sustain pleasure for the powerful, and around them gather the enablers. At first, they rationalize. It's for the stability of the realm. It's exaggerated. It's divine will. Then come the small compromises. One lie in a report, one false record, one silence too many. Each step makes the next easier, until morality collapses completely. By the time they realize what they've built, it's too late. The system sustains itself, feeding on fear, secrecy, and obedience. The victims, then as now, are always the same. The powerless, the unseen, those whose pain will not echo beyond the walls where it happens. Pepe exploited children because no one would defend them. He transformed their suffering into a holy act, wrapping his evil in the language of religion and ritual. We tell ourselves that such horrors belong to the ancient past, that we have evolved beyond them. But the pattern survives, adapted to new worlds. The powerful still gather behind closed doors, their indulgences protected by money and silence. The modern chambers are not carved in stone, but hidden within private estates, luxury islands, and secret networks. Victims still vanish, evidence still disappears, and the perpetrators still die peacefully, their crimes buried with them. Pepe's legacy endures not in monuments, but in warning. He proved that with enough authority and enough time, any atrocity can become normal. The nobles of his court called his rituals sacred. The priests sanctified his murders. The people offered their children as if to a god. A civilization once famed for its light and wisdom remade itself in service of one man's hunger. Today's tyrants may lack the title of God-King, but their reach is broader than Pepe could ever imagine. Their power flows through corporations, governments, and hidden systems of influence. Their victims may not die beneath pyramids, but the machinery of exploitation remains. Different tools, same pattern, the gradual acceptance of the unacceptable, the silence that feeds the abyss. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it again, that ancient sound beneath the sands of time, the faint echo of the symphony of the damned, reminding us that even gods can rot and civilizations can die from within. Chapter 8, The Echoes Beneath the Sand. You want to move, to shout, to stop what's unfolding before your eyes, but you don't. You can't. The system around you has devoured conscience itself, transforming horror into normalcy, agony into ritual. What was once unbearable has become routine. The boy before you, small, trembling, honey-coated, is not the first, nor the last. And as his screams fade into the drone of insects, you realize something chilling. This world has accepted the sound of suffering as the sound of order. That child lived and died over 4,000 years ago. His name is lost to time. His laughter, his mother's songs, the games he played by the Nile, all erased. We know of him only because his tiny skeleton was found in a pit among hundreds of others, each scarred by identical patterns of torment. Every one of them a child, everyone a life consumed for the pleasure of a dying god. Archaeologists can count the bones, trace the trauma, and build statistics, but numbers cannot convey what was truly lost. Multiply one forgotten boy by 50,000, 50,000 childhoods, 50,000 mothers who once whispered their sons' names in joy, 50,000 futures unmade by a single man's appetite. They believed, in their final moments, that they would vanish into nothingness, that no one would ever know or care that they had existed. And in one sense, they were right. No monuments carry their names, no temples honor their spirits. History books barely acknowledge them, except as anonymous data. They survive only as faint shadows in the demographic record, and as small skeletons buried beneath centuries of silence. Yet in another sense, they achieved something their pharaoh never could. They ended his civilization. The absence of those children crippled Egypt more effectively than any army could have. Their missing lives became a hole so vast that the entire kingdom fell into it. The old kingdom did not collapse under the weight of invasion or natural disaster. It imploded under the moral and demographic void Pepi II created. His victims destroyed him by ceasing to exist. Their extinction unraveled the empire's future. They conquered by dying. Pepi II lived nearly a century, dying peacefully, wrapped in silk and gold, believing himself eternal. No human hand ever punished him. His name endures in chronicles and museum plaques. His pyramid still scars the desert skyline. But his victims achieved something more profound. They earned truth. Their bones became testimony. Their silence roared across 4,000 years, condemning the empire that consumed them. Each fragile rib, each tiny skull, speaks louder than all the carved hieroglyphs that glorified their killer. They are history's most haunting echo. The sound of innocence turned into indictment. When visitors walk among the ruins of Saqqara today, they see Pepi's crumbling pyramid still rising faintly from the sand. Guards tell tourists it's closed for restoration. In truth, it's been sealed for generations, and not for preservation, but for fear. There are rooms beneath that monument no one dares reopen. Chambers still heavy with secrets too terrible for daylight. Egypt protects its ancient dead, but some tombs are sealed not to honor the past, but to keep it from repeating. Even now, the legacy of that horror lingers in the smallest traditions. Some Egyptian families, tracing their ancestry back thousands of years, still refuse to eat honey. When asked why, they only shrug. It's tradition. We just don't. They cannot name the reason, but somewhere deep in the collective memory, the sweetness of honey still carries the bitterness of death. Beauty concealing horror. Gold masking decay. Beneath the sand, sealed away from time, lie vessels crusted with resin and honey, mixed with fragments of bone and forgotten human remains. Archaeologists hesitate to dig further, not out of reverence but fear of what more they might find. For every uncovered grave, there are dozens still buried, each whispering of a darkness far older and more methodical than any myth. That 12-year-old boy, from 2200 BC, died in agony, his small frame torn apart by the swarm. Yet his death endures, not as a forgotten tragedy, but as a warning that echoes through the ages. His voice still screams across millennia, telling us what happens when power exists without restraint, when human cruelty is sanctified by ritual, when society forgets that morality must stand above authority. The question now is not whether his voice still cries out. It does. The question is whether we are listening, whether we can recognize the pattern when it reappears, disguised by modern rituals and new names, whether we can stop another civilization from devouring its children in the name of power, progress, or pleasure. History doesn't repeat itself word for word, it rhymes. And the rhyme of Pepi II, the rhythm of consumption, obedience, and decay, still pulses beneath our own world. We just call it by different titles. We hide it behind institutions, disguising exploitation as necessity. But the bones remember, the earth remembers, the statistics remember. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them. The 50,000 children, still screaming beneath layers of sand and time, begging us not to let it happen again. They remind us that monsters are not born, they are made, and it is civilization itself that molds them. The Pharaoh is long dead, his victims are dust, but the pattern, the machinery of power and cruelty, waits patiently for its next awakening, waiting for a new ruler, a new system, another moment when conscience sleeps and obedience thrives, waiting to prove again that all it takes for the world to fall is one God-king too long on his throne. And if the boy who died in honey could speak today, perhaps he would say only this: "Remember me, not for my suffering, but for the truth my death revealed." That every civilization stands one heartbeat away from becoming its own Egypt. Here is the full analytical breakdown of the most perverted pharaoh in history. The horrific story of Pepi II. Chapter 1. The Honey Chambers of Horror. The story opens with an unsettling tableau beneath the sands of Egypt. Torches flicker along the palace walls, casting shadows over a trembling figure smeared in honey. Pharaoh Pepi II, frail, yet terrifyingly alert, sits upon his golden throne as insects swarm the boy before him. This gruesome ritual, half entertainment, half devotion, reveals not only the pharaoh's madness but also the empire's complicity. No one dares to look away. This introduction sets the tone, a world where power no longer serves creation, but consumption. The scene forces us to confront the brutal truth that unchecked divinity corrupts absolutely. Lesson theme: power without restraint turns the sacred into the grotesque. Viewer, question: what would you do if serving the divine meant surrendering your humanity? Chapter 2. A child crowned in blood. Rewinding to Pepi's childhood, we witness the origin of his nightmare. At 6 years old, the boy king inherits a throne built on violence. His coronation is a spectacle of ritual cruelty, blood, sacrifice, and divine proclamations echoing across temple walls. The child is told he is no longer mortal, his heart belongs to the gods. Yet beneath the ceremonial chants lies isolation. A mind too young for command, too fragile for divinity, begins to twist under the weight of expectation. This chapter humanizes the monster, showing how divinity imposed too early breeds not holiness, but horror. Lesson theme: when power is forced upon innocence, corruption becomes destiny. Viewer, question: do you think evil is born or created by those who worship it? Chapter 3. The making of a monster. Years pass, and Pepi's curiosity turns dark. With no one left to question him, he begins using slaves, prisoners, and animals for his studies. He records screams, measures how long life can endure pain, and invents devices meant to extract truth. The palace becomes a theater of agony, masquerading as research. Courtiers whisper but never intervene, for to question the divine is treason. This section highlights the transformation from child ruler to sadistic experimenter, exploring the psychological erosion of empathy under absolute rule. Lesson theme: when fear replaces accountability, cruelty becomes normalized. Viewer: question: is obedience still a virtue when it allows monsters to thrive? Chapter 4. The birth of the honey rituals. What begins as idle fascination becomes organized horror. Pepi designs the infamous honey chambers, each more elaborate than the last. Victims are coated in honey and left for insects, an offering both to the gods and his own morbid curiosity. The chambers grow into a subterranean labyrinth of terror. Servants construct entire systems to perfect these rituals, transforming torture into a bureaucratic routine. This is where the line between worship and wickedness dissolves completely. The scene captures the chilling efficiency of institutionalized evil. Lesson theme: when cruelty is systematized, it stops being madness and becomes culture. Viewer: question: how far would a society go to maintain power under the guise of faith? Chapter 5. Egypt's machinery of obedience. By this stage, Egypt itself functions as an extension of Pepi's will. Entire villages are forced into honey production, priests create hymns that justify his rituals, and scribes erase any record of dissent. Fear replaces faith. Obedience becomes the highest moral law. Even the gods are rewritten to fit his cruelty. Through propaganda and ritual, the people forget what mercy feels like. Civilization, once a beacon of culture and science, devolves into a hive of silence and survival. This chapter reveals how tyranny doesn't just rule a nation, it rewires its soul. Lesson theme: the greatest empires fall not from rebellion, but from silence. Viewer question: do you think fear can hold a society together longer than truth? Chapter 6. The fall of a civilization. Years pass. The Pharaoh, now ancient and rotting from within, watches his empire crumble. Crops fail, rivers dry, and workers flee. Yet the honey chambers still function, proof that even as Egypt starves, its god demands satisfaction. The contrast between grandeur and decay becomes unbearable. The story paints a haunting image of a civilization that sacrificed its own future for one man's obsession. The collapse feels inevitable, as though the gods themselves have turned their gaze away. Lesson theme: no throne can outlast the suffering it creates. Viewer question: when a kingdom is built on pain, is its destruction justice or mercy? Chapter 7. Death of a God King. In the final years of his life, Pepi drifts between lucidity and madness. He sees himself as both deity and child, the victim and the executioner. When death finally comes, it's disturbingly peaceful. The servants burn his chambers, burying secrets beneath molten gold and honey jars. Egypt mourns him in public but celebrates in whispers. The boy who was crowned in blood ends his life surrounded by ghosts of his own making. His death marks not an ending, but a curse, one that will haunt the sands forever. Lesson theme: power can preserve your name, but not your humanity. Viewer question: do you think history should remember tyrants or let them fade into dust? Chapter 8. The echoes beneath the sand. Centuries later, archaeologists unearth fragments of Pepi's horror, honey-coated bones, ritual carvings, inscriptions of worship twisted into confession. The story shifts from recounting events to reflecting on memory itself. The narrator wonders if human nature has changed at all, or if power still tempts us toward the same darkness. Pepi becomes less a man and more a mirror for humanity's potential for cruelty. The final image is chilling. Even in ruin, The Chambers Whisper. Lesson theme: every civilization carries the seeds of its own corruption. Viewer. Question: are we any different from the people who once worshipped monsters? Final thoughts. The tale of Pepi II is less about Egypt's forgotten pharaoh and more about the timeless disease of power. His life stands as an allegory for how belief, when weaponized, turns wisdom into fear and glory into decay. It's a mirror reflecting our own civilizations, reminding us that progress without morality is only another kind of empire waiting to fall. If this story left you questioning the nature of power and humanity's obsession with control, subscribe for more historical mysteries and dark explorations. Together, we uncover the truths buried beneath history's golden lies.